On September 28, 1982, 7 young seminarians from the Archdiocese of Chicago set out for a 3-day spiritual retreat at St. Anne's Monastery. Their names were Ethan Kerrigan, Luke Peterson, Aaron Morton, Matt Kessler, Chris Langford, Gabe Tanner, and Brendan Pollock, all between the ages of 20 and 25, all devoted to their calling. On the morning of October 1st, their beds were empty. No note, no farewell. 7 future priests had vanished into the night. For 21 years, the Catholic Church held to the same story. These young men had simply walked away from their vocation, choosing instead to return to secular life. But their families never believed it. How could 7 exemplary seminarians disappear all at once, without a trace? In 2003, a confidential file resurfaced in the Vatican archives. What these documents revealed shook the very foundations of the Church in America. Because these 7 young men had not abandoned their faith, they had been silenced for uncovering something unimaginable. Before we go further with this haunting story, if you appreciate investigations into mysterious cases like this one, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. Now let's go back to where it all began. The Midwest in 1982 was still steeped in tradition. In Chicago's South Side, the diocesan seminary stood as a cornerstone of the Catholic community. Located on West 35th Street, the massive 19th-century building had trained generations of priests. That year, 43 seminarians were under the direction of Bishop Henry Leclerc, who had led the archdiocese since 1975. A man in his 60s, born and raised in Illinois, Bishop Leclerc was respected across the region for his discipline and his closeness to the faithful. Under his leadership, the seminary remained steady, even as vocations declined across the country. Among that year's class, 7 young men stood out. Ethan Kerrigan, 22, son of a fisherman and a schoolteacher from a small lakeside town in Wisconsin. Tall, with chestnut hair and piercing blue eyes, Ethan impressed his professors with his early mastery of theology and his ability to recite long passages of scripture in Latin. Since childhood, he had dreamed of serving as a missionary overseas. Luke Peterson, 24, was the eldest of 8 children from a working-class family in Michigan. Before joining the seminary, he had spent 3 years in his father's cannery. Strong, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands, Luke carried a maturity his classmates admired. He excelled in philosophy and dreamed of serving in rural parishes. Aaron Morton, 23, from a suburb of Chicago, had a remarkable intelligence. A high school graduate at 16, he could have pursued an academic career, but instead followed the priesthood after a mystical experience during a pilgrimage. Thin, sharp-featured, with wire-rimmed glasses, Aaron fascinated his professors with his deep knowledge of the early church fathers and his command of Greek. Matt Kessler, the youngest at 21, came from a small town in Iowa. Orphaned of his father at 12, he was raised by his mother, a seamstress, and his grandmother. Shy and reserved, with red hair and freckles, Matt was known for his fervent devotion. He spent hours in silent adoration and practiced strict penances. Chris Langford, 25, was the oldest of the group. Once a promising law student in St. Louis, he left behind a legal career after his younger brother died in a car accident. Tall and dignified, with slick black hair and a commanding presence, Chris brought to the group an expertise in canon law that even his professors admired. Gabe Tanner, 22, the son of a painter from a small Minnesota town, had inherited his father's artistic touch. Sensitive, with curly blonde hair and green eyes, Gabe decorated the chapels with extraordinary paintings and illuminated calligraphy. His calling had come during a retreat with monks in the Rockies. Finally, Brendan Pollock, just 20, the youngest son of a fisherman and a nurse from the shores of Lake Michigan. With dark brown hair and a luminous smile, Brendan had a natural charisma that drew people in. Gifted with languages, he spoke English, Spanish, and Irish Gaelic. His dream was to serve in Northern Ireland. These 7 young men were inseparable, studying together, praying together, sharing their doubts and their hopes. Their professors saw them as the bright future of the American clergy. Guiding them was Father Frank Gillen, their 58-year-old spiritual director, a priest from Chicago who had mentored them since their arrival. St. Anne's Monastery, their retreat destination, stood in the rolling hills of rural Wisconsin, 70 miles from Chicago. Founded in the 17th century by French missionaries, the site drew thousands of pilgrims every year. Its stone buildings housed a community of 12 contemplative nuns, led by Sister Mary Clare Glover, a 64-year-old woman known for her wisdom and discretion. On Monday morning, September 28th, the seminarians climbed into the seminary's Ford Econoline van, driven by Father Gillen. The ride was filled with cheerful banter. Up front, Ethan talked with Father Gillen about the hardships facing local fishermen, while Luke and Aaron debated moral theology. In the back, the others sang old hymns. At precisely 2:30 p.m., the van pulled through the monastery gates. Sister Mary Clare greeted them in the parlor, a stark, whitewashed room furnished with simple wooden chairs and a large wooden crucifix. The nun, a small woman with gray hair tucked under her habit, explained the 3-day schedule: prayer, meditation, partial fasting, and one-on-one spiritual direction with Father Gillen. Their rooms were in the east wing of the main building, narrow cells with a single bed, a wooden table and chair, and a small sink. The windows overlooked gardens where vegetables and herbs grew. Silence after night prayers at 9 p.m. was strictly observed. The first day unfolded as planned. At 6 a.m., the monastery bells rang. The seminarians gathered for morning prayer, followed by Mass at 7. Breakfast in silence consisted of homemade bread, butter, preserves, and hot coffee. The morning hours were devoted to Eucharistic adoration and private meditation on John of the Cross. That afternoon, Father Gillen delivered a lecture on evangelical poverty in the modern world. Later, near the fountain in the cloister garden, Aaron Morton quietly approached Ethan Kerrigan. The two spoke in low voices, visibly troubled. Sister Mary Clare, arranging chrysanthemums near the statue of St. Anne, noticed them but paid little mind. That evening, after a modest dinner of vegetable soup, grilled fish, bread, and orchard apples, the monastery fell into silence. At 9:15, Father Gillen made his customary round of the dormitory hallway. Behind Chris Langford's door, he heard faint murmurs, but assumed the young man was praying his rosary, as usual. The second day began in much the same way. But at breakfast, Sister Mary Clare noticed a shift. Several of the seminarians appeared tense. Matt, usually quiet and devout, seemed especially restless and barely touched his food. Gabe Tanner stared down into his bowl of coffee substitute, avoiding Father Gillen's eyes. Around 10 o'clock during adoration, Sister Mary Clare noticed Luke Peterson and Brendan Pollock speaking in hushed, urgent tones near the wooden cross in the monastery garden. When she moved closer to remind them of the retreat's silence, they broke apart immediately. But the worry etched on their faces lingered in her mind. That afternoon, Father Gillen began one-on-one spiritual sessions in a small office adjoining the sacristy. He met first with Ethan, then Aaron, then Chris. Each conversation lasted about 30 minutes. Sister Bernadette, the 45-year-old doorkeeper, overheard muffled voices through the thin wall, more heated than usual. During Chris's session, she could clearly make out raised tones. Dinner that evening unfolded under heavy silence. The 7 seminarians avoided one another's eyes. Even Father Gillen seemed on edge, fidgeting nervously with his breviary resting beside his plate. Again and again, his anxious glances fell upon the young men he had guided for years. After night prayers, around 9:30, Sister Mary Clare passed Father Gillen in the cloister. He said he was headed to the chapel for private prayer, as was his habit. She returned to her room in the west wing, separated from the seminarians' quarters by the church and courtyard. At exactly 10 o'clock, Sister Bernadette made her nightly rounds, ensuring every door was locked: the main entrance, the side garden door, and finally the iron gate leading to the road. Everything was secure. The keys were placed in Sister Mary Clare's desk drawer, just as the rules required. The night of September 30th into October 1st, 1982, would remain forever seared into St. Anne's dark history. Around 3 in the morning, Sister Teresa, the monastery nurse, was startled awake by a dull noise from the courtyard. 60 years old and slowed by arthritis, she struggled to her window. In the dim light, she thought she saw a shadow near the chapel, but couldn't be sure. Her fading eyesight betrayed her. Convinced it was nothing more than a stray cat, she returned to bed. At 6 a.m., the bells rang for morning prayer. As the nuns gathered in the chapel, Sister Mary Clare was surprised not to see Father Gillen or the seminarians in their usual pews. Assuming they were late, she began the service. But by 7, with still no sign of them, her worry deepened. She climbed to the second floor of the east wing and knocked at Father Gillen's door. No response. She opened it. The bed was unmade, but his belongings were still there. His open breviary on the desk, his glasses resting on the nightstand. Panic surged when she discovered the seminarians' rooms in the same condition. Beds unmade, but all personal possessions left behind: clothes, prayer books, toiletries. Nothing suggested a voluntary departure. At that moment, Sister Mary Claire phoned the Sheriff's Department in rural Dane County, which had jurisdiction over the monastery grounds. Deputy Chief Mark Curvin, 52, arrived with his partner, Sergeant Alan Stevens. Their preliminary inspection revealed no signs of forced entry. Every door was locked from the inside, the keys in their usual place. The second-floor windows were far too high for anyone to escape without a ladder. No broken objects, no signs of struggle. By mid-morning, the case had escalated to the Madison Police Department, and by 11:30, lead investigator James Garrity, a seasoned homicide detective, was officially in charge. He quickly uncovered a troubling clue. Father Gillen's handwritten Mass register ended abruptly on Wednesday, September 29th. The final entry read, "Mass at 6 p.m., special intention, that the truth may come to light, whatever the cost." The cryptic phrasing stood in stark contrast to the priest's normally measured style. What truth was he hoping to reveal? And what was the cost he feared? The family's lives were torn apart in the weeks that followed. Ethan Kerrigan's father, John, a respected fisherman from Sheboygan, refused to accept the official explanation. A man hardened by years at sea, his hands calloused by rope and salt, he repeated the same words to every investigator. Ethan would never leave without a word. "Not my son, not like this." His wife Margaret, a beloved elementary school teacher, sank into a deep depression, spending hours by the window of their small home, staring toward the lake as though her son might suddenly appear. Her students noticed her change. Once warm and energetic, she grew distant, forgetting to correct assignments or prepare lessons. In rural Michigan, Luke Peterson's family suffered the same agony. His father, a cannery owner, was forced to shut down operations temporarily. His mother prayed novenas and made pilgrimages, clinging to hope. The younger siblings couldn't understand how their responsible, protective brother could have simply abandoned them, Aaron Morton's parents. Both intellectuals from suburban Chicago, his father a literature professor, his mother a librarian, reacted with methodical determination. They built a meticulous file, clipping every article, corresponding with the other families, pressing officials relentlessly. Aaron's father, Andrew, wrote letters to the state attorney general and even to the Department of Justice, demanding answers. Matt Kessler's widowed mother in Iowa was crushed. A seamstress who had poured all her hopes into her only son, she now worked in silence. Her shop, once alive with conversation, now shunned by neighbors who whispered superstitions about her family's misfortune. Chris Langford's disappearance devastated his prominent St. Louis family. His father, a successful attorney, leveraged every connection he had, pressuring the courts, even hiring a private investigator from Chicago. The man uncovered nothing. In Minnesota, Gabe Tanner's parents responded differently. His father, an eccentric painter, became obsessed, channeling his grief into disturbing canvases of 7 shadowy figures dissolving into mist. His mother, who ran a small art gallery, worried for his sanity, and on the shores of Lake Michigan, Brendan Pollock's parents bore the loss with quiet resignation. His father, a fisherman who had already lost 2 brothers to storms, accepted tragedy as part of life at sea. His mother, a midwife, kept working, delivering new life into the world while silently mourning her son. Despite the desperate efforts of families and police, the investigation stalled. Witnesses were unreliable. A farmer swore he saw headlights near the monastery at 3 a.m., but he was known for drinking. A nun from a neighboring convent claimed she heard male voices in the night, but her hearing was poor. Police dogs brought in days later lost the scent at the monastery's front gate, as if the 8 men had vanished into thin air. Ballistic and toxicology tests revealed nothing. No signs of struggle, no drugs, no blood. Bishop Leclerc issued a statement that satisfied civil authorities but outraged families. The seminarians had left voluntarily, likely due to personal crises of faith. Behind closed doors, he hinted at temptations of the world. It was an explanation investigators were eager to accept. But the families never stopped asking the obvious questions. How could 7 young men, all devout, all exemplary, suddenly lose their faith at the exact same moment? Why leave in absolute secrecy, abandoning everything, even treasured possessions like Ethan's communion watch and Matt's baptism medal? 6 months after the disappearance, in April of 1983, the investigation was officially suspended for lack of new leads. The file was boxed and sent to cold storage at the Madison Police Department, labeled as a presumed voluntary disappearance. That administrative decision crushed the family's hopes of ever getting an answer. John Kerrigan refused to give up. With the help of Andrew Morton, Aaron's father, he formed an informal group they called Truth for Our Sons. The 2 men couldn't have been more different, one a hard-bitten fisherman from Wisconsin, the other an academic from suburban Chicago. But they were united by the same relentless need for the truth. They organized searches through the Wisconsin countryside, questioned residents of nearby towns, and combed public records across the state in search of any clue. Their amateur investigation gradually surfaced details the official inquiry had overlooked. Multiple witnesses described unusual vehicles near St. Anne's in the days leading up to the disappearance. A gas station owner in a nearby town remembered selling fuel to several men in dark suits who spoke with an East Coast accent. A rural mail carrier said he'd passed strangers taking photographs of the monastery from the county road. Any one of these accounts could be dismissed as trivial, but together they formed a pattern. Someone had been watching the retreat. Someone had prepared what happened. As the years passed, the case faded from public memory. After a handful of sensational headlines, local papers moved on. New classes of seminarians knew nothing of the 7 who'd vanished. The church, facing declining vocations and broader cultural headwinds, preferred to forget the embarrassment. Only the families kept the memory alive. Every October 1st, they gathered at St. Anne's for a memorial mass led by a young, sympathetic priest. At first, the service drew many friends and neighbors. But each year the crowd thinned. By 1992, 10 years after the disappearance, only the 7 families and a few stubborn parishioners still came. Fate would revive the case in a way no one expected. In June 2003, amid the nationwide abuse crisis shaking the Catholic Church in America, Pope John Paul II ordered a sweeping review of U.S. dioceses. Compliance teams demanded full access to sensitive archives. By then, Bishop Henry LeClaire had long since retired, replaced in 1995 by Bishop Alan Plant, and was living quietly in a priest's retirement home outside Madison. Eager to demonstrate transparency, Bishop Plant ordered the Chancery's archives opened for review. That was when Mark Doran, a 38-year-old investigative reporter for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, received rare permission to consult certain diocesan files for a feature on the church's evolution in the Midwest. Doran, a former seminarian-turned-lay journalist, knew the institution's inner workings. His reputation for discretion opened doors that were usually sealed. On the morning of June 18, 2003, Doran descended into the basement stacks of the Archdiocese of Chicago's Chancery Annex, where many records from the seminary and affiliated houses were stored, accompanied by the diocesan archivist, Father Peter Kearney. 65, meticulous and soft-spoken, Father Kearney had spent 4 decades preserving the written memory of the diocese. He guided Doran through dust-coated shelves holding thousands of files spanning 2 centuries of Catholic life. Around 3:30 p.m., while leafing through a 1982 correspondence ledger, Doran found a cardboard folder stamped confidential. Inside, the St. Anne case. Father Kearney, puzzled, said he'd never seen it before. It had been tucked behind other volumes in a rarely consulted section. The folder contained about 20 typed documents, some on archdiocesan letterhead, some from the Apostolic Nunciature in Washington, D.C., and others bearing seals from the Vatican Secretariat of State. The first document, dated October 5, 1982, 5 days after the disappearance, carried Bishop LeClaire's signature. It opened with chilling words, "Your Eminence, I confirm that the cleanup operation proceeded as instructed." The 7 inconvenient witnesses have been permanently silenced. The bureaucratic euphemism could not hide the reality. It was an admission of a coordinated killing. The bishop was reporting to his superiors in Rome about the elimination of the seminarians, as if it were a routine administrative task. The subsequent papers revealed the scale of the conspiracy. An internal Vatican memo signed by Cardinal Agostino Casaroli stressed the need to protect the institution from revelations that could destroy it. Another letter referenced a network tasked with safeguarding the Church's higher interests across multiple jurisdictions. Doran quietly photographed every page with a miniature camera. Father Kearney, loyal to the Church but horrified, did not stop him. Both men understood the magnitude of what they were holding, proof of one of the gravest scandals in American Catholic history. Back in his Chicago apartment that night, Doran spread the copies across his desk and began to reconstruct the puzzle. The 7 seminarians had uncovered a pedophile ring involving senior church figures in the region. The ring, overseen by an influential prelate whose name surfaced obliquely in the documents, had operated for years across several Midwestern dioceses. A letter dated the day before the disappearance revealed the seminarians had assembled damning evidence. With his legal training, Aaron had compiled a meticulous dossier, victim testimonies, compromising photographs and financial records showing hush-money payments to families. Their spiritual director, Father Frank Gillen, knew. Suddenly, his final entry in the Mass Register made sense, that the truth may come to light, whatever the cost, a desperate plea before the group was silenced. He understood they were in mortal danger, but he could never have imagined the Church itself would order their deaths. One document described the method. The operation had been assigned to a specialized team led by a former military man turned ecclesiastical fixer. The bodies were dissolved in acid and the remains scattered into Lake Michigan off the Door County coast. No physical trace remained of the 8 men murdered that night. The correspondence also showed the breadth of institutional cover. Several bishops were informed. The Apostolic Nunciature in Washington gave its approval. Rome itself sanctioned the radical solution to preserve the honor and survival of the universal Church. Families were kept in the dark through a carefully orchestrated disinformation campaign. Doran realized he held evidence that could shake the Church to its core, and that possessing it might put him in danger. The men who ordered the murder of 8 innocents would not hesitate to silence a reporter. He contacted Paul Delacroix, a prominent criminal attorney in Chicago known for litigating cases involving the Church. 52, a former devout Catholic turned outspoken advocate for victims, Delacroix examined the documents. His assessment was unequivocal. This was hard evidence of homicide committed to protect a pedophile network. The scandal of the century. In the days that followed, Doran discreetly reached out to John Kerrigan and Andrew Morton, the 2 fathers who had never stopped searching. 21 years after their sons vanished, the men, now aged and worn, finally saw their suspicions confirmed in the worst possible way. They met one July evening in 2003 at a small inn on a back road in Door County, far from prying eyes. John Kerrigan, his face carved by decades of worry, hands trembling, scanned the photocopies. His first words were simple. "I knew it. I knew Ethan didn't just walk away." Andrew Morton, precise and analytical even in grief, examined each page with a scholar's focus. Beneath the cool exterior, the pain was overwhelming. "They killed our sons to protect monsters." The journalist laid out the complexity of what came next. Making these documents public would unleash an earthquake unlike anything the American Catholic Church had ever faced. But it would also put everyone involved at risk of deadly retaliation. The men who had ordered the killings in 1982 still held powerful positions in the hierarchy. Some had even been promoted since. Attorney Paul Delacroix warned of the legal barriers. Statutes of limitation had long expired for most crimes. Only murder remained exempt, but without bodies or direct witnesses, convictions would be nearly impossible. The Church had erased all physical traces. The papers were damning, but their authenticity would be challenged by an army of lawyers. Meanwhile, Father Peter Kearney, the archivist who had helped uncover the files, was tormented. 65 years old, he had devoted his life to the Church, only to learn it had committed the unthinkable. At night, he was haunted by the faces of the 7 seminarians he had once known personally. He remembered their zeal, their sincerity, their dreams of service, all murdered to protect predators and collars. Father Kearney made a fateful decision. He began reaching out one by one to the surviving families. Some parents had already passed away, carrying their grief to the grave. Others received the truth with shock and devastation. Mary Joseph Peterson, now 73, collapsed when she heard what had happened to her son Luke. She had raised 8 children with dignity and sacrifice, only to learn that her eldest had died a martyr for justice. Annette Kessler, Matt's mother, 64 and long assumed broken by grief, responded with cold fury. "My son died because he wanted to protect innocent children. The whole world must know, no matter the cost." Chris Langford's family split. His father, retired attorney Harold Langford, was determined to file lawsuits and use his connections in politics and law. His wife Françoise, older and weary, feared what a public scandal might do to the family's reputation. Gabe Tanner's parents reacted through art. His father painted vengeful angels striking down priests in black robes. His mother quietly turned their small Minneapolis gallery into a secret memorial, displaying his canvases alongside texts about innocent sacrifice to institutional hypocrisy. On the Lake Michigan shore, Brendan Pollock's parents, Alan and Josette, now 70 and 68, faced the truth with seafaring stoicism. "The storm always brings up what's been hidden beneath the waves," Alan said simply. Josette, a midwife who had delivered hundreds of babies, now saw this battle for truth as her final earthly mission. Gradually, a clandestine network took shape. Families, the journalist Doran, Father Kearney, and attorney Delacroix, ex-seminarians who had gone on to priesthood elsewhere, began offering quiet testimony about the climate of fear in 1982. The documents suggested the pedophile network stretched beyond Chicago into Milwaukee, St. Paul, even St. Louis. Suspicious transfers of priests masked the reassignment of abusers whose crimes had been uncovered. The method was always the same: a quiet transfer, victims paid off, silence enforced. One name surfaced more than any other: Archbishop Alan Kurgan, once an auxiliary in Chicago, promoted to Archbishop of St. Louis in 1988. A powerful member of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Kurgan appeared to have coordinated the network. His office had been the nerve center, shuffling predators, buying silence, eliminating threats. A letter dated October 15, 1982, revealed his satisfaction after the killings. "The St. Anne incident is permanently closed. Our operators did clean work. No trace remains. We may resume our activities with confidence." The cynicism was breathtaking. The file also exposed a financial system. Money for these operations came from diverted parish funds, hidden in shadow ledgers under the label institutional communication expenses. Families of those who carried out the crimes were paid generously for their loyalty. Faced with the scope of these revelations, Doran knew he couldn't turn back. But he also knew that publishing them would start a war. The church commanded immense resources, elite lawyers, political connections, media influence, and, if necessary, the same radical methods it had used before. The decision came during a secret meeting on August 15, 2003, at the Kerrigan family home in Sheboygan. Around the big kitchen table where Ethan had once eaten as a boy sat representatives of the 7 families: Doran, Delacroix, and Father Kearney, John Kerrigan, his face lined by 21 years of fruitless searching, spoke first. "Our sons died because they wanted to protect innocent children. If we stay silent now, their sacrifice means nothing. More children will suffer." His voice trembled, but his resolve was iron. Andrew Morton, the former professor, laid out the strategy with precision. Coordinated publication across multiple national outlets would make suppression impossible. He had contacts at the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune. Attorney Delacroix explained the legal offensive. File simultaneous murder complaints in every jurisdiction involved. Alert state attorneys general. Petition the U.S. Supreme Court. Even appeal to international human rights courts. The church would claim forgery, but handwriting experts had already confirmed the signatures. Then Father Kearney added something critical. "I am not the only archivist. Others have found similar documents. In Milwaukee, in St. Paul, even in St. Louis. Together, they could build an unassailable case." That fall, the machine of revelation roared to life. Doran coordinated simultaneous publication in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, and several regional papers. The headlines were explosive. 7 seminarians murdered to protect pedophile network. American church accused of crimes against humanity. Vatican-sanctioned deadly conspiracy. The church's response came swiftly. The next day, Bishop Alan Plant of Chicago held a press conference inside the diocesan chancery. stern and defiant. He declared, "These documents are crude forgeries fabricated by enemies of the Church. Never has this institution ordered killings." But his denial began to unravel. Father Kearney, pressed by reporters, confirmed the authenticity of the archives. His decades of impeccable service gave his words extraordinary weight. "I've given 40 years of my life to the Church. I would not accuse it lightly. These documents are genuine. I stake my soul on it." Then came more witnesses. Retired Sheriff's Deputy Mark Curvin, who had led the first investigation in 1982, admitted the pressure he'd faced. "I was told not to push too far. The county executive himself told me to shut it down. I always wondered why." And Jean-Marie Cadeau, an elderly former employee of the diocesan chancery, confirmed that in the fall of 1982, Bishop Leclerc had personally burned boxes of documents in the garden night after night. "He forbade me from going near the fire. Whole crates disappeared in flames." The noose tightened. Archbishop Alan Kurgan, identified as the network's coordinator, initially refused to respond. Barricaded inside his archbishop's residence, on Locust Street, he issued a terse statement through his office. His Excellency would not comment on slanderous, baseless allegations. But the reporting kept uncovering more. Survivors, now adults, finally found the courage to speak in public. Peter Mason, 43, described how, at 12, he was abused by a priest connected to Chicago. When he tried to tell someone, men in suits visited his parents. They said speaking out would ruin his future. They paid the family to keep quiet. One testimony after another confirmed the truth. There had been an organized system of intimidation and hush money. The Midwestern Church had functioned like a criminal enterprise, using blackmail payoffs and ultimately murder to protect predatory clergy. The crisis went global when the Vatican responded. Cardinal Angelo Sodano, the Secretary of State, released a statement from Rome. The Holy See condemned any violence and would fully cooperate with authorities. But the boilerplate words did little to mask the Curia's embarrassment. The documents made its role in the cover-up painfully clear. By November, the pressure on Archbishop Alan Kurgan had become unbearable. Summoned to St. Louis by prosecutors for questioning, the 75-year-old prelate, long known for his iron grip, finally cracked behind closed doors. Faced with the mountain of evidence, he broke down. It was to save the institution, he repeated over and over. "You don't understand what was at stake. If this had come out in 1982, the whole church here would have collapsed. We sacrificed 7 to save millions of souls." The logic was monstrous, but it revealed the mindset of men who believed a divine mission justified any excess. Kurgan detailed the operation. The seminarians had stumbled onto the network while researching church history. Aaron Morton, obsessed with archives, had found victim testimonies in parish files. Together, the 7 conducted a methodical inquiry that identified roughly 20 predatory priests shielded by the hierarchy. They compiled a full case file to deliver to civil authorities after the retreat. Father Frank Gillen, their confidant, warned them of the danger but admired their courage. "They were saints," Kurgan admitted. "Saints dangerous to our institutional survival." The investigation that followed confirmed every point. Forensic examiners authenticated the documents. Witnesses multiplied, sketching the portrait of a church riddled with abuse and willing to do anything to preserve its power. In February 2004, Archbishop Kurgan was indicted for murder and conspiracy to commit murder. For his own safety, he was held without bail at the Federal Detention Center in Chicago. Several other prelates were charged as well, including retired Bishop Henry Leclerc, brought from his nursing home, 3 auxiliary bishops, and more than a dozen priests tied to the network. Trial began in June 2005 in Madison, Wisconsin, drawing worldwide media. It was the first time the Catholic Church in America faced a courtroom over organized murder. John Kerrigan, now in his 70s, testified with shattering dignity. "My son Ethan wanted to be a priest to protect the innocent. He died a martyr to that cause. I don't blame him for choosing justice over his own safety. I blame those who killed him to protect criminals." Andrew Morton, older and in failing health, delivered a precise, devastating account. They murdered our sons in cold blood, then lived for 20 years as if nothing had happened, saying Mass, blessing marriages, consoling grieving families. What hypocrisy. The other families spoke in turn, bringing their sons back to life in words. Annette Kessler described Matt's fierce faith. He fasted every Friday, spent hours in prayer. He dreamed of helping children overseas. They killed him because he tried to protect the children here. On September 15, 2005, the verdicts landed. Archbishop Kurgan was sentenced to life without parole for aggravated murder. Bishop Leclerc, due to age and health, received 15 years. Other accomplices drew 5 to 20 years. But beyond the sentences, the church itself emerged permanently shaken. The breadth of the network sparked a mass exodus of the faithful. Vocations collapsed, donations plummeted, parishes closed for lack of money and priests. In the Midwest especially, the impact was devastating. Sanctuaries emptied, pilgrimages withered. St. Anne's, forever stained by the memory of the killings, lost its visitors. The monastery closed in 2007. The last nuns dispersed to other communities. The families won financial damages, but money could not erase decades of suffering. Men like John Kerrigan and Andrew Morton spent their remaining years building a foundation to support survivors of ecclesiastical abuse. Others, exhausted by the fight, chose to live out their days quietly. Reporter Mark Doran received prestigious awards for his investigation, but he took no pleasure in them. "I wish I'd never found those papers," he said. "Knowing that 7 generous young men died trying to protect innocent children will weigh on me for the rest of my life." Father Peter Kearney, by then a symbol of clergy choosing truth over institution, left the church in 2006. At 68, the man who had given his life to God could no longer wear the collar. "How can I represent an institution that ordered killings? My conscience won't allow it." In 2010, 5 years after the trial, a memorial was unveiled at St. Anne's in Wisconsin to honor the 7 murdered seminarians. Their names were carved into granite beneath the words, "Died protecting the innocent." Every October 1st, the surviving families and a handful of faithful gather for an ecumenical service led by a Protestant pastor. The local Catholic leadership refuses to participate. The story kept echoing. In 2015, new documents showed the network had reached far beyond the Midwest. In 2016, Pope Francis formally apologized to the families in a private audience. But for Margaret Kerrigan, Ethan's mother, who died in 2012 at 88, the apologies came too late. In her last wishes, she wrote, "I carry to the grave the image of my son, pure and generous. Remember that he died a hero, not a coward." Today, the former seminary in Chicago houses a center for survivors of sexual abuse. The rooms where young men once trained for priesthood now welcome therapists and social workers. The transformation is symbolic of the long road since 1982. From concealment to recognition, from institutional silence to judicial transparency. The 7 seminarians of Chicago will be remembered as one of the darkest scandals in American Catholic history. Their fate shows how institutional blindness can slide into organized crime when power is at stake. But it also reveals the strength of human resolve in the face of injustice. Parents who never stopped searching, a journalist who risked his life to tell the truth, an archivist who chose conscience over career. What do you make of this story? Did you notice the warning signs that might have prevented this tragedy? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this in-depth investigation moved you, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Leave a like if this story shook you, and share it with someone who follows major cases. Because keeping the memory of these tragedies alive is how we keep them from happening again.